In particular, it felt great to be in community with people connected to Purdue, connected to this region, and connected to elsewheres in this time around these common sets of intersecting issues. The way things were framed yesterday was fantastic. I mean, the problems that we're facing are real, and there are many kinds of crises around us, and yet we're in a moment of possibility. One thing that yesterday really laid out for me is that really the role of time in the things we're talking about. We're in this moment of possibility. We have ongoing crises that seem so prevalent, and yet that focus can also blind us to more recent and more enduring kinds of arrangements in this world. We open by acknowledging that the lands we are on have not always belonged to people in the same ways that they do now. And myself, I was struck to look up at a map of the United States because I think of the founding kinds of myths of this country. We sort of have a vision of this place stabilized in our minds as it always was. But the physical territories of the United States, which include territories overseas, has been configured really less than 100 years, right, in the late 50s. The United States has existed for less than 250 years. And when it did, it was a small portion of land. And the founding kinds of documents that structure what this great project of the United States are also grounded in their own kinds of mythologies about us all man being created equal. And yet the institutions that were created from that did not consider all men to be all people like we believe it right now. You had to be a white passing, whatever that meant at the time, right? Man who owned property to be those who are free. And those structures continue to permeate how this country is and is founded, creating injustices of all kinds that endure structurally in the landscape. We sort of believe in this broader project, and we should, of hope and change to invoke different times. And yet there's conceptual violence there that assumes that human is man or a version of man. And some of that has also been excluding questions around gender or even the presence of women and non-dominant men as reasonable or existing historical actors with any kinds of power in their own lives. So thinking with time and thinking about gender, I am really excited to be chairing this panel and really happy that you are all here. And thank you for humoring me with my thoughts as we begin today. I had my schedule going, but perhaps you can see it. Yes, okay. So today we are going to begin with Anna Irwin, who is currently a postdoctoral research associate in the Purdue University Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And we're really delighted to have her work on how intersectionality shapes adaptation to social ecological change. Then we'll hear from Lisa Young, an assistant professor in the Department of English at the College of Charleston, and on some of her work. And then Mangala Subramanian, our very own professor and director of the Susan Buckley Butler Center for Leadership Excellence at Purdue, will join us in some words of discussion. And then we will open it up for a conversation together today. So with that, I invite Anna to join us.
Okay, how is that for everyone?
Looks perfect.
Great for me.
Okay, I'm gonna keep, let me see. I'm actually gonna minimize that. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for that fantastic introduction. Welcome to my presentation. Intersectionality Shapes Adaptation to Social Ecological Change. My name is Dr. Anna Irwin. I'm a postdoctoral research associate in Purdue University's Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. I'm also a part of the Arequipa Nexus Institute, whose logo is here in the middle. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Before I move forward, I want to bring attention to my co-authors listed below. This presentation gleans from an article we published in World Development last fall. I would also like to thank the organizers, especially Laura Zanotti, for taking the time to plan this symposium and inviting me to speak. This research is part of a large mixed method study in Peru that investigates equity or possibilities for equity in the context of climate change, agriculture, mining, and water scarcity. In this presentation, I'm going to demonstrate how we applied feminist theory, in this case, a theory found in intersectionality, a theory found in Black feminist scholarship, to both illuminate injustices and speak to ways to decrease those injustices. In particular, we applied the theory of intersectionality to examine why and how certain groups have challenges responding to social ecological change. We found that intersectionality, the way that identities intersect within systems of power, shapes how people respond to change, and addressing these inequalities necessitates policies that approach adaptation through an intersectional lens. This research is funded by the Arequipa Nexus Institute for Food, Energy, Water, and the Environment, a collaborative interdisciplinary research partnership between Purdue University and the Universidad Nacional de San Agustín de Arequipa. Okay, first I want to provide some background into Peru. When we think about Peru, we have to think about Machu Picchu, the Amazon, a vibrant culture, indigenous peoples. I'm sure many of you have visited this magnificent country. Peru is one of the most geographically diverse countries in the world, with the Andes, the Atacama Desert, the Amazon, and the Pacific Ocean. Even with political corruption and conflict, it is also one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America. At the same time that Peru has seen prosperity due to tourism and other economic activities, Peruvians face multiple social ecological stressors. First, Peru is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. Many people receive their water from glaciers, and many studies, both from the biophysical and social sciences, have shown that these glaciers are in fact retreating. Moreover, it is one of the most water-scarce countries in the world. In response to this water scarcity, they have implemented numerous large-scale water transfer projects and countrywide efforts at integrated watershed management. Finally, a key part of Peru's economic growth has been through extractive industries like mining. And in many ways, mining has supported socioeconomic development. However, it has also destroyed many ecosystems and water supplies in already water-scarce areas. So today, I'm going to first describe our context, which is the Caylloma province of Peru. I'm then going to present our environmental justice framework and explain how the theory of intersectionality is woven throughout this study. I will then describe our research design, discuss our results, explain some discussion points, and finally speak to our conclusions and policy implications. Okay, so we collected data across 4 sites, including the following. So first we have Caylloma, which is a district that's about 14,200 feet above sea level. Here, most people practice pastoralism through working with alpaca and llama. We also have Cabana Conde, which is here. Next, Cabana Conde sits at about 10,800 feet above sea level. This district largely consists of smallholder agriculture, livestock, and tourism. Madrigal, as you see here, is about 10,700 feet above sea level. People in this district rely on smallholder agriculture and livestock and mining. Majes here, what you see at the bottom. This district is about 35 years old and sits at about 4,600 feet above sea level. 35 years ago, the Peruvian government, along with the World Bank and others, built the Majes Canal, which is outlined here in red. It moves water from the northern part of the province near the Caylloma district to the Atacama Desert, which is now home to the Majes district. What has resulted has been a huge agricultural and population boom. For example, before the Majes Canal, the population was around 0. Now it's over 100,000. Many factors connect these 4 sites, including they're all being impacted by climate change. People move between and among these sites, and they have all been subject to conflict over the Majes Canal, or they receive water from the canal. In this slide, I'm going to describe how I apply an environmental justice approach to my work. I will then describe how my team applied a similar approach to analyze adaptation to social ecological change. You will notice that intersectionality upholds this approach. Intersectionality is a theory that was founded by Black feminist scholars. It shows how policies and programs that are geared toward one type of identity, such as gender or race, rarely addresses those who are multiply vulnerable. Not addressing these multiple vulnerabilities can further marginalize groups. We use this understanding of intersectionality in every step of our research process. First, I apply an environmental justice approach by investigating who is most impacted by environmental injustices like environmental racism or climate change. I also investigate factors that increase people's vulnerabilities to social ecological change, including social inequality and marginalization. In this study, we first researched how and why certain districts in the province were experiencing more challenges than others. We also worked to understand differential impacts and vulnerabilities across the province. These insights informed our site selection. Second, I collect data from those most impacted and vulnerable, as well as people at additional scales, including local leaders and former organizational professionals. In this study, we applied an intersectional lens to interview people from across the agricultural sector. We interviewed smallholder farmers who are men, but we also interviewed women, people who worked in agriculture through entrepreneurship, farm workers, and irrigators, and migrants. Third, I analyzed organizations and policies from multiple perspectives and frameworks based in feminist theory. For this article, we analyzed people's perceptions of public adaptation spaces through the lens of intersectionality. In particular, we asked who had more challenges to adaptation to climate change, and analyzed and discovered where marginalized people have agency and power. Sorry about the sirens that are outside my door right now.
You can pause a moment for the institutions of the state.
Thank you. I think it'll be gone in a second. It happens all the time. So finally, I make recommendations, we're good now, that inform policies that they are more inclusive of the needs and concerns of impacted parties. After our analysis, we made recommendations to decrease the obstacles that certain groups, especially women, migrants, and indigenous people face when accessing public adaptation spaces. The results of this study contribute to and expand literature in 4 main categories. First, this research draws from and contributes to interdisciplinary studies that demonstrate how both climate is changing and the ways that the changing climate is impacting vulnerable populations in Peru. Next, we conducted analysis on what we call public adaptation spaces. What we defined as communal spaces where people come together to make adaptation decisions. Our results contribute to interdisciplinary studies demonstrating how people respond to social ecological changes at different geographic scales and in public space. As I mentioned in the prior slides, the team and I then applied the theory of intersectionality, a perspective that was articulated by a Black feminist movement, most notably Kimberly Crenshaw, to design our study, analyze our data, make recommendations. Finally, we gleaned from feminist geographers, including Sultana and Nightingale, who apply feminist theory to analyze how gender and other factors intersect to create differential outcomes in the context of social ecological change and the capacity to address those changes in adaptation spaces. The study is a part of a large mixed method social science study. The part I'm presenting today is from the qualitative stage, where I spent 4 months in the field across 4 sites, collecting 130 semi-structured interviews with a variety of actors, conducting participant observations, and collecting and analyzing relevant documents. Integral to this study is the international collaboration between Purdue and UNSA. We have worked with our counterparts in Peru at every stage of the research. We applied purposive and snowball sampling to gather data from a variety of actors. We are also constantly working to address our power and privilege by working by improving our collaborative efforts and in learning from our counterparts in Peru. We worked together to finalize the code book through conducting intercreditor agreements. After we finalized the code book, I conducted a thematic analysis along with content analysis to better understand how identities intersect to create differential adaptation. As you can imagine, when we first approached data collection and analysis, we learned that there are many types of people across the province. This includes farmers, pastoralists, older folks, residents, minors, and women, as well as many other types of folks. However, certain identity groupings emerge as facing more challenges, as well as having less challenges than others. In particular, we found that land-owning men who speak Spanish have more power in public adaptation spaces, which further marginalize Indigenous women and migrants. First, I want to quickly highlight just how people perceive climatic and other social ecological changes in this area. As one pastoralist explained to me, nature has changed so much, there is no water. For example, before in the hills, you could see snow. Now there is no snow. That is why there is no water. This year, our animals died daily because there is no grass. Then they start to get sick and diseases come, and since the alpacas no longer have resistance, they are easily attacked by the diseases and die. This quote exemplifies the social ecological changes people told us about time and time again, and that are mentioned in the literature, like glacial melt, dying animals, and water scarcity. People pursued public adaptation in community spaces and community institutions such as irrigation commissions. For example, many communities wanted to shift away from rustic canals that you see here. These are very beautiful. However, these canals cause a lot of water loss in already water scarce areas. People come together in public adaptation spaces and through community meetings and other gatherings to discuss plans to shift away from things like the rustic canals to cement canals. However, we found that men who spoke Spanish had the most cultural power in public adaptation. For example, women rarely spoke during meetings. We went to multiple community meetings, and out of the 40 people who spoke, one was a woman. Many women told us they did not feel comfortable speaking in meetings. As two told me, I do not speak, my husband does, I just listen. Another woman told me, there are many men who talk a lot, women are silent. I'm frank and sincere to speak with, but even I'm afraid. Even when I do talk, I'm scared people will make fun of me. Second, we found that almost all meetings were held in Spanish, which created additional obstacles for Indigenous women who spoke Quechua. This created even more challenges for older Indigenous women, as the majority of them were not educated in schools, while older Indigenous men attended schools where they learned Spanish. For example, one Quechua-speaking woman explained to me as follows: in the past, there were no schools for women. However, another woman told me, the meetings are in Spanish, but sometimes also in Quechua. Some people do not speak Spanish, so if we have questions, we ask. Third, we discovered that landowners had voting rights and could run for office in community organizations, but minors and renters could not. Folks explained this to me as follows: sometimes I go to listen, this is what one migrant told me, but I have no voting voice. And a local leader told me, who was also a commission president, there are many farmers who have always rented the plot, who is always on the land, who knows when and how and when the waters arrive, the problems they have, and he is the one who, however, he is the one who also has to face the authorities. So integral to intersectional analysis is unearthing how different identities intersect and create inequalities among individuals and groups, and demonstrating how structural and systemic issues reinforce these inequalities. First, this research suggests that gender intersects with language and land ownership to either support or restrain decision-making power of individuals and groups in public adaptation. Our results also show that structural power in public spaces is not only legitimized through formal rules, such as land ownership, but is also reinforced by who is historically and continually interacting with institutions, the ways that formal institutions and states shape Indigenous systems, and the associated social norms related to language and gender. At the same time, some individuals were able to exercise their agency in these spaces. That's while some people may have similar backgrounds, they also have different levels of comfort with participating in adaptation spaces. Relatedly, we also recognize that women, Quechua speakers, migrants, and renters can exercise their power in many ways including discussing their opinions with someone who represents them. However, how these ideas transmit from the private to the public spaces or through conversations to these public adaptation spaces is often little understood, if not misunderstood. And one cannot assume that such representation is always accurate or adequate. So in conclusion, this research not only demonstrates the utility of using an intersectional lens and approach to identify the diversity of actors within the Caylloma province, it also provides additional explanations for unequal adaptation among these actors and how factors such as gender, language, and migration status, when intersecting with each other, limit and increase power within adaptation institutions. These findings could assist adaptation practitioners and policymakers to design policies and programs that facilitate adaptation among actors with diverse backgrounds. In addition, these results further support calls for research approaches that recognize the heterogeneity of individual and community responses to social ecological change, and the need to assess public participation in light of intersectional dimensions of identity. Finally, from a policy perspective, we recognize that implementing an intersectional analysis in any given context can be time-consuming and complicated. However, even with this complexity, our results suggest an investigation of the political, social, and cultural realities of existing natural resource institutions, as well as a way that intersecting identities compound power and oppression in public spaces could strengthen partnerships for adaptation. So here are my references if folks are interested. Also, I want to thank everyone. This concludes my presentation. If we can't cover your questions during this time, please feel free to contact me through my email or Twitter. And if you're interested in our approach and our paper more broadly speaking these results, our publication is open access and role development. So thank you, everyone.
Now we have time for some remarks from Professor Mangala Subramaniam, Professor and Director of the Susan Butler Center for Leadership Excellence at Purdue University, and so much more. And we welcome your remarks following the presentations today.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Lee Johnson. I first want to say thanks to Dr. Laura Gianotti and everyone who was involved in putting this symposium together. I'm so very pleased that the grant from the Butler Center, which I had, has been put to such tremendous and terrific use in this symposium. It's amazing to see the diversity of speakers and everyone involved. It's totally commendable. Just so that you know, I did not see these presentations in advance, so I'm also hearing about them as all of you are. But just a few thoughts on both of these presentations. Thank you so much, both to Dr. Irwin and Dr. Young. And it's so terrific to see two different contexts being presented on a panel session around gender and inclusion. Some thoughts, it's great to see works which use intersectionality, and it's also great to hear a word that I like very much from Dr. Young about how different axes of difference become salient at different points in time and make us actually think about the dynamics of what is happening in lives, but also the consequences of those dynamics, right? When you think about what is most salient. And I really enjoy, as always, and Lisa has worked with me before, so I always enjoy this bringing in a different lens to thinking about the issue of environmental racism, environmental justice issues. And Anna, I really enjoyed knowing a little bit more about Peru, something that I didn't know in the past, although I've read articles. So it's nice to hear about it. I had kind of a couple of questions, comments that I hope you both will think about. One is, as you both were talking about intersectionality and the salience of race, when we kind of start examining what's happening, right, in studies or through texts, as Lisa uses. How do relations of power, change? Are they dynamic? How do we think about voices, and I know you used, I think Lisa, you used this word, where and how do we incorporate voices? And I say this because Anna, you talked about gender, language, immigrant status, and maybe there's more in your paper. And I kept wondering, are you talking about immigrant status in relation to kind of labor status? And does that have a dynamic that is, where gender is embedded in that dynamic in itself, right? That is what is salient here when you look across those categories. So I was wondering if you both could think a little bit and maybe explain a bit more about how, again, to repeat myself, how relations of power may be changing, how they are dynamic or fluid. I know, Anna, you referenced a little bit about different spheres, but how do they change and how do we see this change? Do we see this change across immigrant status, right, across these families? And same way for you, Lisa, I'd love to hear more about the two texts that you referenced and whether how you see this dynamic, looking to the past and the present, and do you see this change or altering, and what kinds of voices come into play in those instances? Is it only race? Is there something else that's also embedded right inside that? So that was one part. And the second, really for Anna, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about your in the field experience. You said you spent 4 months. I am somebody who does, like probably anthropologist, one of the few sociologists who does a lot of field-based data collection. So I'm always curious to hear about the dynamics of data collection in the field, both the challenges and the opportunities to learn. And in some sense, how do you navigate dangers in the field, and danger being used very, very broadly, not necessarily just physical violence. I'd be curious to hear more about that. I'll stop here because I think that I want to have some time for the people who are attending to have a chance to ask questions as well.
Yeah.
Yesterday, we also talked a little bit about redefining what environmentalism is and what the environmental movement is, because it's very narrowly defined. And I think that causes a lot of violence in many different ways and damage. And so I'm going to now speak to some of the questions. And so I was thinking about the idea. So inherent in the theory of intersectionality is the concept that it's dynamic, constantly changing. I didn't get into that as much as I wanted to for the so many things I could not get into as much as I wanted to because of time. And so I want to speak to that. First of all, as I mentioned for a moment, women have they have a lot of power and agency within these spaces, as well as in other places. And of course it changes. And of course, like I said, it does depend sometimes on the individual and their comfort within these spaces. However, what I wanted to really point out was that, number one, laws and culture often do create additional obstacles for some sorts of, for certain people. And I think it's important one of the reasons why I and my team and I really decided to sort of go this route was because a lot of scholarship does focus on the smallholder farmer who's in our imagination, a man, kind of like how we perceive farmers in the US to be white men, right? So we have that same sort of imagination, I think, in a lot of adaptation scholarship. And so part of the goal was to really illuminate that so many other people are part of the conversation, and they need to be, and they have a lot more challenges to adaptation. Their knowledges are different, and they have more, often more obstacles. Not always, though. That's where the dynamics come in, right? And I also want to add, so that a lot of times there are other spaces where women have a lot more power, which we find all over the world, right? These sort of community institutions are quite common in the global South, especially around water. However, there's always other institutions that we don't look for. But I also think that in development, and I'm a policy scholar, so a lot of times we just don't look to those institutions as places to partner with. And so it's not that they don't have power, it's just that I don't think that these spaces are really recognized enough for the power that they have. And that leads on to your next question about immigrant status. And so most of the people that I speak of are domestic migrants. So they've moved from one area within the province. Oftentimes in the high Andes, they're often indigenous people who lived in areas where they were smallholder farmers. And then they moved from those areas to places like, I think I mentioned the big area, Majes, where they've seen the huge population boom in the last 35 years. They often move from high elevation spaces and places to these places that have agriculture and economic booms. So it's interesting because in their homes, they obviously are the smallholder farmers and they're indigenous people. They have a lot of power. However, when they move to these new areas, they do not have the economic capital often to buy land. In order to have access to water, you have to have an own land, especially in new places. We see this a lot in urbanizing areas as well. And so, but it doesn't mean they don't have power. They have come together and created community associations to resist these sorts of and make demands on the local municipalities and subnational governments to increase their rights. So they do have power. I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but I think that maybe that gives a little more clarity to the situation around migration and who I'm speaking of when I talk about that. So thanks.